I was a senior in college finishing up my photography major when I began to hear hushed murmurs from my cohort about urbex, urban exploration. For those of you who don't know, urbex is when people usually illegally break into abandoned locations and go exploring, usually just for the hell of it. It's become increasingly popular with photographers, however, because many of the occupants and businesses in these decrepit buildings just up and left, leaving all sorts of records and items behind. It's like living in a snapshot from decades if not centuries ago. As soon as you make your first cautious step into the building, it takes hold of you and transports you into the past. I gained enough confidence to go urbexing with a few friends, and it didn't take long for me to fall in love. I visited abandoned funeral homes that were shut down a century ago, where I marveled at how the place still smelled of the embalming fluid still stored there, safe in their jars. Aside from the layers of dust and debris, it looked and felt as if a funeral service would be held there within the hour. There was an open casket near the pastor's podium, sitting there with its polished oak and fine velvet interior, still waiting to take someone to their final destination. I explored abandoned hospitals and mental institutions. There have been TV shows that have tried to convey what the inside of these places look like, but they hardly compare to being there yourself. It's like you're in the gold room from The Shining. You seem to be locked in a time warp for the duration of your stay. For instance, when I explored a mental hospital in the middle of my state, I continuously expected for a deranged mental patient to come shuffling around every corner, which had me sweating bullets and kept me on edge all night long. Places of despair and suffering are especially prone to the collection of energy. I am absolutely certain that there are patients within the building that still reside there, even though their bodily forms have long since decayed. But enough about that. Every urban explorer in my home state of Florida knows about River Country. Located within the Fort Wilderness Campground on Walt Disney World property, it's actually very easy to break into if you know what you're doing and where you need to go. Don't ask me how I got in. I won't tell you. It's a thing for people of all ages to do, whether to experience the nostalgia of visiting the water park, or because they are so obsessed with Disney that visiting the decrepit water park has become a rite of passage. The brave souls who visit the abandoned water park know that if they are caught, they will be permanently banned from Disney World for life. But for some guys like me and my friend Joe, the cheap thrill of exploration outweighed the consequences of being banned from the biggest tourist trap in the eastern United States. After our first and admittedly brief visit to River Country one day before going drinking in downtown Disney, we decided that we wanted to swim the short distance between the park and Discovery Island. For those of you who don't know, Discovery Island is essentially a precursor to Animal Kingdom. It functioned as a small zoo with a various assortment of animals. When River Country was shut down and Animal Kingdom opened around the same time, the animals from Discovery Island were moved to the theme park. A section of Animal Kingdom is still called Discovery Island to this day, as a homage to the now abandoned island. Anyway, Joe and I started planning that day as to how to gain access to the island. I'm sure you've also heard, Disney has eyes everywhere. There are cameras and security guards everywhere you look, and thankfully you can learn to spot them. Joe and I hunched over our liquor in the most crowded parts of the bars of Pleasure Island, as we discussed in hushed voices about our plans. When Joe and I went back to our hotel room after drinking, I quickly pulled out my laptop to do some research on the area around River Country, Discovery Island, and Bay Lake, which is the lake that the island sits in. The first thing I noticed is how much stuff there is online with regards to boat schedules and where security will be throughout Disney World at any given time. Joe and I used these articles and forum posts to know when to avoid being around the island shores. We also used aerial maps to estimate how long we had to swim. While many Disney forums said that it would be a grueling 100-foot swim, Joe and I realized that it would be a 100-yard swim after visiting Fort Wilderness and River Country for ourselves. Thankfully, Joe and I are both strong swimmers, so the excursion would not be a problem for us. The two of us would set out shortly after dusk. We packed essentials like water, food, and some survival gear just in case, into a couple of waterproof bags that would act as our personal floating devices, as we swam from River Country to Discovery Island. Then we left our car at the hotel, and took one of the complimentary Disney shuttles to Fort Wilderness, where we spent the day acting like tourists. sitting on the benches, playing in the pool, and visiting the animals at the campground's petting zoo. When dusk came and the security guards went home for the night, Joe and I made our way back into river country, which was to be our launching point to the island and our returning point when we came back. We operated in pitch darkness, making as little noise as possible as we found the hole in the fence that allowed us to enter the abandoned water park. As with almost every other abandoned location I've been to, river country looked frozen in time. Joe and I took some time to explore the empty pools and water slides of the park before making our way to our launching point. The silence of the night was broken when we started hearing banjo music blaring from everywhere, which made me jump out of my skin. I've probably seen Deliverance one too many times. Soon after the corny little banjo music came on, path lights began to illuminate a safe route to our launch point. Apparently Disney still ran electricity and music to their abandoned properties. The swim to Discovery Island was about as easy as I expected it to be. There were pages and pages of forms that warned us of the alligators and brain-eating bacteria that populated Bay Lake, but I did not heed their advice. Every native Floridian grows up on swimming with alligators and diving in natural waterways, so swimming in Bay Lake would be no different. Joe and I made it to Discovery Island after about 30 minutes of slow swimming. We threw the waterproof bags on our backs and made our way into the island where it would be harder to spot us. Within our first few minutes on the island, Joe and I got this feeling of being watched, like we were being stalked by some large predator. He chalked it up to the adrenaline and called me a pussy as we found the first path to follow. My childhood memories of Discovery Island are ones that I'll always cherish. I got to spend a week camping with my family at Fort Wilderness, and we would often take the ferry over to the island to visit the tropical birds and see the collections of exotic animals. It was like a scene straight out of Jungle Book, with its sculpted plants and the din of animals rustling and calling out from the lush trees above. The quaint little island still holds this charm, although the plants have overgrown and have taken over the island, giving it a more wild appearance. The path we chose led up to a series of cages and small fences. It was obvious that during its glory days, this area housed a number of exotic birds that were free to roam around as they pleased. The cages were probably used to house small mammals or large birds of some sort. Joe and I walked around the area, noting how the shallow ponds and sculpted waterfalls still retained their beauty. We then went to inspect the cages, which still had their exhibit signs on them. There was a large array of South American and African birds that once lived there, with the occasional mammal. But now all the cages were empty. I was inspecting the cage that once housed toucans when I heard some shuffling nearby. Joe, what is that?" I asked, looking around to spot the danger. Joe pulled a knife from his pocket and brandished it in the direction of the noise. He threatened to knife whatever came out of the bushes, until we saw what it was. It was a tortoise, a giant tortoise. "Look, he must be a stowaway," I exclaimed, walking over to it and squatting down. It hissed at me and raised its head in defense, as we were probably the first humans he had seen. "I bet you his parents laid eggs that the staff never noticed. There's probably a few of these guys scooting around this island. There's certainly enough vegetation for them to eat." I patted the tortoise's shell as Joe made his way over to do the same. "See? This island isn't so bad, huh?" he said as he pet our new friend. His toothy grin reeked of the confidence and fearlessness that I lacked. Joe and I spent a few more minutes with the tortoise before we moved on to explore the rest of the island. We found more exhibits and pathways that led this way and that. We couldn't help but take our time to explore each exhibit area and read every sign, spending an uneventful night nestled in the thick foliage of Discovery Island. Daytime was different. We had agreed to wait until dawn to start exploring the buildings, the majority of which we had found during our nighttime scooting. First was a gift shop, located just inside the main dock, where the ferry used to pull in. The cheery images of Mickey, Minnie, Goofy, and Donald Duck in safari gear still looked new, even if the colors were slightly faded. There was still merchandise on the shelves as well. Joe stuffed a magnet into his pocket, while I looked at all the stuffed animals and t-shirts. I, for one, wasn't keen on stealing. Once we were finished checking out the gift shop, We went to go explore the buildings and indoor animal houses. These buildings were still all pitch black, save for the small areas of light that shone through the windows. Joe and I pulled out our flashlights and quickly realized that we were not alone. Eyes. There were dozens of pairs of eyes reflecting in the light back at us. Joe and I froze in our tracks as we saw a colony of monkeys looking back at us. They were larger and far more muscular than any monkey that I've ever seen, possibly a cross between multiple species that used to be on display. One of them yawned and showed off his fangs that were easily the size of my middle finger. We had to get out of there quickly. "More leftovers," Joe murmured to me as we began shuffling backwards towards the exit. We didn't focus on the group of primates who were beginning to congregate. My friend's heel caught on something as we moved, and he fell backwards, hitting his head on the cold concrete below with a loud smack, where he became unconscious. The colony of monkeys noticed Joe's fall as well, and acting like one large animal, they banded together and moved in sync towards the still body of my friend, whooping and hollering at the tops of their lungs. Their screams sounded human-like as they approached, some of them standing on two legs as they did so. The larger monkeys had to be at least 7 feet tall on their hind legs, looking almost human-like, with patches of shaggy brown hair on their heads and coarse, short hair on their bodies, with about 20 of them now approaching Joe and I with a predatory stare. I knew I was going to be no match fighting them off, and I did something that I'm still not proud of to this day. I backed up about 25 yards away or so from my unconscious friend before the colony of monkeys closed in. What happened next is something that I'll never forget. The monkeys, who now surrounded my friend, began to eat him alive. Joe's screams of anguish were deafened by the screams of the monkeys, who were now excited and enraged. They took large, bloody bites out of my friend, ripping him apart like a child's doll. Joe had a slow death, slower than I would have imagined from him being ripped open, but I can only assume that he was in a state of shock when the monkeys began to violently tear his intestines and other organs out of his body and drag them off to their own corners of the room to devour. Occasionally, 2 monkeys would fight over a body part, and I would often hear the loud crack of his bones being broken. I waited until each last monkey was occupied with eating before I made my escape out of the building and to the edge of the island. Thankfully, none of them pursued me as I made my leave, beelining it to the opposite side of the island. My best friend was gone. It was his idea to go to this stupid island. He called me a pussy for being so afraid. I guess I was right after all to have my wits about me, because he was now in a dozen pieces being ravenously devoured by some strange mutant primates that Disney doesn't want the world to know about. I bet there are more animals on that island, ones that have evolved and mutated to become monsters. I didn't stick around to find out, I can tell you that for sure. Being banned by some stupid park was far safer than being stuck on that island with God knows what. I don't even remember the swim back to River Country, except for the fact that I made it back to the Fort Wilderness campground safely, without getting caught. I reported to the police that my friend went missing during our trip to Disney World, and that he may have gone to explore Discovery Island by himself. As far as I know, the police never followed up on that, but I alone know Joe's fate. Upon returning home, and taking a week of personal time to recover, I went to a local Urbex meetup and told people what happened to my friend Joe. I was expecting surprised reactions from all of them, but instead I was met with understanding and sympathy. Apparently many people go out to Discovery Island. It's a thing, just like breaking into River Country is. However, most people don't make it back from the island alive, and the ones that do share their stories of predatory animals of all shapes and sizes. Some who survive their visit to Discovery Island say that Disney has a child trafficking ring, and the children who don't survive are brought to the island so that no evidence can be found. Others say that black magic and human sacrifices are performed there to keep Disney's profits up. Walt Disney himself knew a lot about the occult, as the stories go. It doesn't matter which rumor about Discovery Island that you choose to believe. or why you would even want to go exploring on Disney property. If you are wise, you'll heed my advice and never swim out to that goddamned island. If you do, prepare for the horrors that await you in the one place that lifts the innocent veil of the happiest place on earth.
During the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Disneyland resort faced a number of serious incidents, including several severe injuries and even a few deaths. As has been covered in the media, one person was killed and several injured in a malfunction of the sailing ship Columbia ride in 1998. Following an extensive investigation by the California Department of Health and Safety, Disney was fined for serious violations, including the failure to adequately train park employees, implement proper safety features, or even maintain attractions correctly. The accidents continued into the early 2000s, including a collision on the Big Thunder Mountain Railroad that killed one guest and maimed several others. Mysteriously, several high-level park officials were fired during this time, some of which later filed whistleblower lawsuits. One manager at the park warned Disney officials of the poor safety of attractions in 1996, and was subsequently laid off. It does seem bizarre that such a wealthy corporation would have a poor standard of maintenance. However, each Disney park does generally run separately, with an independent set of finances. During the late 1990s, the California Disney Park ran into significant economic troubles, with lower than expected attendance, partly due to competition with the new nearby Six Flags park. The local resort management simply could not afford to continue the quality of maintenance one would expect from a Disney park. Budgets were slashed, operations and services suffered, and several people died or were injured as a result. At least, this is the official narrative. Disney Corp claims that, out of a population of nearly 650 million visitors to Disneyland Park in its history, chances of death or injury are negligible for guests. However, as a park employee from 1994 to 2003, I can safely say that the number of reported deaths barely scratches the surface. While the park may have significantly improved from its prior status, some pretty bizarre shit happened in the late 90s, only a small fraction of which has been picked up by the mainstream media or noticed by investigators, or even Disney management itself. As a 9-year worker under Mickey Mouse, a large amount of incredibly strange stuff happened, some of which I am at a loss to explain. In the summer of 1994, after graduating from Anaheim Community College, I landed a job as a ride operator at Disneyland, located only a few miles from my apartment. I was offered a great paycheck and had the benefits of working in a familiar place of childhood nostalgia. The work itself was pretty simple, loading guests onto the rides, making sure that all the riders were secure, and then controlling the attraction from the dashboard. Disney had just implemented a new ride control system, using a computerized panel and video cameras to keep watch over the ride. If you've ever been to a theme park, you've probably seen this system. The ride operator sits over a control panel, with different monitors displaying video camera footage of the ride, and can control the movements of the cars. I largely worked in the Fantasyland section of the park, particularly working the longest shifts on the Matterhorn bobsleds. At first, my employment seemed great. While the shifts could be a bit monotonous, the salary was very high, and I was even to move from my smaller apartment into a townhouse, farther from the park. For these reasons, while I was considering the job only for a temporary position over the summer, I decided to stay with Disney for a longer time. This is the point where stuff begins to get a little, well, strange. In the spring of 1995, Disney made all the park employees sign a somewhat disconcerting contract, barring us from discussing park operations with members of the public. This essentially meant that I would be unable to talk about my job with friends and family. It also meant that any whistleblowers who complained about safety in the attractions could be laid off. Some of my fellow workers were outraged. Personally, the contract didn't really concern me, as I had no reason to discuss the specifics of my work with members of the general public. It was also at the same time, in April or May of 1995, that anomalies started to occur. These were minor, but somewhat disturbing events that confused me and my fellow ride operators. For example, while running the Matterhorn bobsleds once, I strapped in 2 young brothers, probably 5 or 6 years old. I next sat down at the dashboard to keep track of the ride. The thing is, I never saw the brothers' bobsled on any of the monitors. It's as if they had vanished. Naturally, I was somewhat disturbed and assumed that their car had broken down at some point on the track, and thus was unable to continue to the other sections of the track that were monitored by the video cameras. However, the other cars continued to move along the track. About 7 minutes after I had sent off the 2 young kids, their car mysteriously arrived back at the station, despite apparently not traveling through any of the monitored sections of the rail. Even stranger, the ride typically takes only a couple of minutes to complete, and 7 minutes is almost unheard of. The 2 kids, upon stepping out of the ride, seemed somehow disturbed, while not seemingly afraid or traumatized in any way. They just seemed somehow confused or disoriented. After they left the ride, I never saw them in the park again. After reporting this incident to my superiors, I was ignored. One park official even threatened me. This would be the first such anomaly, and the cast member team would see a considerable number of such events in the future. Some of these incidents were explainable. Park officials claimed that video camera equipment was probably malfunctioning, and that young kids were sometimes just playing pranks on us ride operators. It occurred often, for example, that certain bobsleds became frequently invisible to the cameras, or that positions of the riders within the bobsleds would mysteriously change once they exited the ride. Riders sitting in the front of the sled during the beginning of the ride would end up at the back, and so on. Again, park management chalked up many of these incidents to video camera malfunctions. Certainly, the ride vehicles were difficult to spot anyway against a dark background, as well as guests intentionally pulling pranks on the staff, often by switching seats. However, my fellow employees and I found this official explanation not entirely convincing. For example, certain bobsleds were more likely to experience anomalies than others, and the maintenance team even had a running joke about keeping track of which ride vehicles were haunted. Even stranger, however, riders that experienced these anomalies always seemed somewhat confused and even disturbed, and often were never spotted again on the park premises. By 1996, my fellow employees and I had estimated that approximately 5% of rides on Matterhorn were anomalies. Of these, a very few, perhaps a tenth of all anomalies, were extremely strange and difficult to explain. For example, bobsleds would occasionally exit the ride in the wrong order or take obscenely long lengths of time, often a half hour or more, to complete the ride. The riders experiencing these anomalies were almost always children. It was around this time that the incidents began to spread to other parts of the park. Ride operators at Splash Mountain began reporting similar events, and soon, within a few months, anomalies were occurring all across the park. Official management was no help. We decided simply to ignore the problem, knowing at least that guests would always exit the ride safely, even if somewhat disoriented. It was in January of 1997 that we had realized the severity of the situation. A brother and sister, probably 8 or 9 years old, had entered Splash Mountain on one of the smaller ride vehicles. They did not show up on any of the ride monitors. Waiting over 2 hours, with their car failing to reach the station, the park had reached closing time, and we were ordered to shut down the ride. Our team sent in Tim, a fellow maintenance operator, to search for the children. He never exited the ride. Walking out of the park that night, I swear I could see the faces of those children vaguely in the mist at the edges of Fantasyland. Due to the nature of our contract, we were unable to discuss any of these events with anyone. Several of my fellow employees quit shortly after that, but I decided to stay as I badly needed the money. Throughout 1997 and 1998, we counted several dozen such disappearances, with riders never even exiting the rides. Strangely, despite the vanishing of several kids, we never received any complaints from parents, who naturally should have been inquiring as to the whereabouts of their children. What kind of a parent would just leave their kids at Disneyland? This was about the same time as some of the reported accidents at the park, ultimately leading to a major investigation. Many in the media blamed these events on poor maintenance, but I sense that something far darker was occurring. In 2003, I ultimately left Disneyland, landing at a high-level management position in an insurance firm. This story really has no point that I can see. I have very little idea what happened in Disneyland during those years, and if anybody has any leads, please let me know.
There's always a reason to be afraid.